Okay, I think we're still waiting for a few folks to trickle in. That is one of the drawbacks of Google Meet. The breakout rooms are not very intuitive, so I'm going to give everyone a couple more minutes, and then I think we can go ahead and get started shortly. Desi, would you like me to share my screen of your the PDF slides, or would you like to do so?
Hi, Samantha. I can do it. That's
great.
Okay.
Of course. Great, I think we can go ahead and get started. If other people trickle in, they'll just join us a little bit later. But let's, and maybe, you know, Desi, you and your colleagues, you can give a quick intro to who you are, and we're really excited to be hearing from you guys about, you know, data-driven decision-making in the AFOLU space. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Samantha. Do you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, and we can see your slides.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you everyone for the opportunity to participate in this workshop. I'm Daisy Martinez Baron. I'm the Regional Program Leader for CCAPS in Latin America. CCAPS is the CGIAR research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security. And I'm going to present some of specific cases of using modeling tools in Latin America. Maybe Lini and Jacobo and colleagues can introduce themselves, and then I can start.
Thank you, Daisy. Hi, everyone. My name is Lini Wallenberg, and I lead the CCAF's program on low emissions development. Thank you.
Yes, hello, good morning. My name is Jacobo Arango. I'm a scientist at the Alliance of Biodiversity and SIAT, located in Colombia, and we do research in livestock and greenhouse gas emissions. Sorry.
Great, thank you. I think it's Alejandro and Felipe is also, they are also here.
Hi, Daisy, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alejandro Ruden. I am a research assistant in the Tropical Forests program, and I work generating scientific evidence for low carbon technologies for livestock.
Good morning and good evening, everyone. I am Felipe Torres. I'm working in the greenhouse gases emission. I'm a leader of agriculture emission for the inventory in Colombia. And thank you for the time.
Great, thank you. So just to confirm, you're seeing my screen, right? The presentation.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned, I'm going to present very briefly two cases on in Latin America of how modeling tools have been used in national and regional policy formulation processes. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the nationally determined contribution of Colombia. This was a process led by the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development. And we contributed, we had some technical support there. And then the second one is the Climate Smart Agriculture Regional Strategy for the SICA region. This was led by the Central American Agricultural Council. And the SICA region gathers 8 countries in Central America, including Dominican Republic. So the first case is, as I mentioned, the NDC. So what we did was to provide technical input using an integrated approach of AFOLU sector developed by IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute of the CGIAR. And we worked together with the Andes University. That was one of the technical partners of the government. And what we did was to provide some information to identify what would be the target for emissions reduction in the AFOLU sector. So we provided baseline analysis and mitigation scenarios with mitigation scenarios models, so that we could determine what could be achieved given the global economic environment. So this integrated approach included two considerations. One, that countries could choose among the different portfolios of growth-inducing technologies with different emission characteristics. And second, that countries, as part of the global economic system, they needed that low emissions development strategies were devised based on both on national characteristics and needs, and with that recognition of the role of the international economic environment. So the technical approach basically combined and reconciled limited spatial resolution of macro-level economic models that operate through equilibrium-driven relationships at a global and national level, with detailed models on biophysical processes at high spatial resolution. So the session components that we had in this integrated approach were the impact model, which is a global partial equilibrium model for agricultural commodities that provides plausible pressure for change in agricultural practices and cropland areas. Second, a spatially explicit model of land use choices that provides likely location of changes in agricultural area and other land uses. And third, the crop model that provides yields, GHG emissions, and changes in organic soil. So basically, using these three different models, this was kind of the integrated approach that we used to support this decision-making process and formulation process of the NDC. At the end, the NDC goal in Colombia was to achieve a 20% emissions reductions by 2030. So this was the process. So of the whole process led by the government of Colombia, and we participated in this in the technical work and technical support that we did in 2015, previously INDC submissions, jointly with IFPRI and other different institutions that were part of the process. And here you can find some of the research outputs that we developed from this collaboration where we detailed not only the models used and how the technical approach was implemented, but also what were kind of the stakeholder process that we were kind of working with and putting those, facilitating those science policy dialogues. And the second case is the CSA regional strategy for the SICA region. So what we did there was to provide technical input using the future scenarios, which are an innovative way to future-proof the public and private planning and investments related to climate change. So what we have there is that those policies are usually based on one vision of the future. So we try to develop different visions of the future, and these scenarios aim at assessing if policies are robust enough to face changes in their environment. And so we understand what are those scenarios, and we go back and try to see what would be the best way that policy can be formulated so that in all those different scenarios, those policies are actually useful, are still useful. In these scenarios, we use both quantitative and qualitative data. We try to do this as a very participatory approach. So we have different multiple stories about the future that are described by different stakeholders across the scales. And also we try to understand that the changes in agriculture happen within a system, not in vacuum. So that's the idea of this approach, so that we can make more robust policies. And in terms of the process, so this was the regional strategy. We work with different stakeholders at national level, but as a regional level, and we put all our efforts to support this policy formulation processes with different technical inputs, such as the future scenarios that I just mentioned. The policy was launched in 2017, and it is right now being implemented. And just to mention that, and I'm going to give the floor to my colleagues so they continue with the presentations. Just to mention that this methodology has been also applied in other national processes in the region to strengthen policy formulation. So you see different specific policies that we were supporting with this methodology in Central America, in Honduras, in Costa Rica, also in Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and Bolivia. Thank you very much. Over to you, Lini.
Daisy, I don't know if you turned over to me, but I think Jacobo is next, or Jacobo's team.
Oh, yeah, I forgot. Yeah, you're right, Lini. Jacobo?
Yes, okay. So for that, we would like to introduce case study that we developed in supporting the national government of Colombia in improving the methodological aspects of their calculation for the GHG national inventories. So my colleague Alejandro will explain you how we use a model for calculating the emissions of livestock and reducing uncertainties. And then our colleague Felipe from the government of Colombia will tell you how they were able to incorporate this information into their work. So please proceed, Alejandro and Felipe.
Okay, thank you. So that we are going to share with you one of the many models that we have used to estimate GHG emissions, and specifically methane emissions from the livestock sector. So as a introduction of this topic, the digestive process of ruminants is very particular and very interesting from the biological point of view. This process, as we see here, multiple factors intervene to finally produce the products that the animal needs for its life process. So, among others, there's a symbiotic relationship with the microorganisms that generate byproducts, such as methane. And all these feeds that the animals consume are composed of water and dry matter in others. So what we do here, simulation models, is to estimate how much of these byproducts are generated by the animal from knowing this composition of feed. Livestock emissions are very large and they are difficult to calculate. So what we do here is to study the modifications in a system without intervening them, with a lower cost and time and the prediction of potential answers. And we generate recommendations for improvement, decision support. This is the important topic of the use of model. These are not very accurate answers, but they can give us a route to follow in this topic. So ruminant simulation model was designed last decade from the compendium of other existing models such as the Baldwins, Illions and Gordons, and Sniffen. There were other models that calculated these emissions from the livestock. So Herrero in 2003, he calculated some of these outputs from animals, and this model simulates the digestive and metabolic process. It determines the animal's nutrient need and simulates the fermentation kinetics and the passage of feed components through the gastrointestinal tract. It also estimates milk and meat productions, manure, nitrogen excretions, and methane emissions. Ruminant model parameters. To calculate these emissions, we need to know the composition of the feed. So starch is one of these components, and fat, but they are almost negligible. Significant fractions in feeds are concentrates. The quantities of GAG produced are calculated according to quantity of different fermented substrates. Allometric rules allow the simulation of animals of different body weight, protein, energy interactions, and effect of pH on cell wall degradation. This allows us to model different weight and age animals. So what we see here is the input for animal, the species, current weight, potential body weight gain, mature weight and sex, and the forage as the input for neutral detergent fiber, crude protein, ashes, fat, and appearance, and the system, the modality, and feed system. The model output that we are interested in is methane emissions, but we can also know the milk potential production and the body weight change in a day. So what we see here is how the model works and the different fractions that it uses to calculate the methane emissions by each year, in this part here by animal. So it can give us some tools to calculate the beneficial response from a different forage use in a different system of livestock production.
Okay. Hello, everyone, again. In a few slides, I will show you how the inventory team in Colombia of greenhouse gases emission include the model of Ruminant as part of the team of the calculation from our inventory. So in this way, next, please, Alejandro. Okay. We in the first bar we have just 7 emission factor from 7 age groups of animals for all the country. We estimate different variables as population, dry matter intake, weight, average weight, digestibility, for estimate emission factor for each age group for the inventory. At the beginning of the inventory, we use spreadsheets in Excel. It was hard work for us, so we contact SIAT for the model, for make our job more easy in the inventory team. In the next slide, as showed Alejandro, Ruminant include all need energies as maintenance, activity, growth, lactancy, pregnancy, and we can estimate all emission factor for the country in Colombia more easily for us. Okay. Okay, in the next slide, we divide all country in 10 regions with a different livestock interactions. Yeah. So with a FEDEGAN, Princeton, and SIAT, we can calculate for each region, as you can see on different colors, or different emission factors. In this way, we have in the first board for Colombia and the third communication of climatic change. In this moment, we have maybe around 70 emission factor with Ruminant. So in this way, we reduce all uncertainty from 30% to 50%. It was a big improve in the inventory, and we can estimate all trend for enteric fermentation and menu management too from 1990 to 2040 for each age group in the inventory. As you can see in the next slide, all stakeholders in Colombia can see different emission from livestock for each, in the next slide, please, for each department in Colombia, and we can estimate which age group is more participant in the greenhouse gas emission for our country and for each department, as you can see in the next slide. So in this way, the stakeholder, political and technical, can have a ranking for emission from enteric fermentation in Colombia. The next. Thank you. If you have any question.
Right, Lenny, I think it's over to you.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Oh, good. All right, I'm going to be talking about target setting in agriculture. So how much mitigation is needed in the agriculture sector? We rarely talk about the goal for emissions reductions, but a goal can help guide ambition, can push us to have more ambition. It can indicate the relevance of our progress. Are we 80% of the way there, or 100% of the way there, or 20% of the way there? And it can also drive innovation. Maybe we need new technologies in order to reach our goal. Most countries and projects, and even the CCAF's program, we've often set our goals not by a target, but rather by some arbitrary percentage of the mitigation potential. So this graph just shows you some of the estimated potentials, like in soil carbon, and then it shows a 1.2 gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year. This is globally. And then you can see avoided deforestation by agriculture. We have a gigaton potential of about 4. And then the 1.71, the dark numbers show you the economic potential, what's possible given a certain spending level. And what these numbers tell us is really just what's possible, but they don't tell us what's necessary. If you want to talk about what's necessary, there are at least 6 or 7 different criteria that you need to consider in order to bound your system. And so that first question is just how ambitious do you want to be? Do you want to just look at those technical or economic potentials? Or do you want to set an aspirational goal, something higher than what we think is possible? Or maybe you want to set a conservative goal based on the resources that are available. I would advocate that you tie your goal to a policy target, and in this case, the 1.5 degree or 2 degree target of the Paris Agreement. But it could be a national policy target as well. Another critical factor is by which year to set your target. many of us have talked about 2030, but that's now only 10 years away. Nevertheless, it's a really nice benchmark, and we have to consider at least 2030 targets. And 2050, of course, is when we want to achieve carbon neutrality. Another entirely different approach is to average the emissions reductions that are necessary between now and 2100 by each year and use that as your target. But I don't advocate that because the uncertainty after, especially even 2030, is very high. The next question is whether your target is going to be relative to a base year or some projected business as usual baseline. The 2010 figure is often used as a base year because it has the most recent data. Countries are also using Kyoto baselines. I think 1990 is that required baseline. But now we have, the start of the Paris Agreement, 2020, the implementation of the 2020 Paris Agreement, which I think is also a really good base year to use. And we can also use projections to 2030. So the items in red, if you haven't figured it out yet, are the my own preferred recommended parameters to use in this case. But of course, I'm listing all the options for you to consider. The next is to consider whether you want a % decrease or to actually specify your decrease in terms of gigatons. I think both have their value. In some ways, a % recommendation is more flexible just because our understanding of actual measured emissions is still so poor, especially in many lower income countries. The next question is whether you want to look at your target as an annual target, for instance, 1 gigaton or 1 million tons reduction per year, or whether you look at it as a cumulative emissions reduction over, say, 5 or 10 years. And it's much easier to look at annual, especially when we start looking at things like soil carbon. And almost to the last, food security. You have the option of looking at a target in the future based on either full food security, which is really the goal, and of course an SDG goal as well, or whether we consider scenarios based on current food insecurity. This case, I think both are very important, but just because of a lack of data on full food security scenarios, I've used current % insecurity. And finally, the most vexing problem of all, believe it or not, is just how to define agriculture. And so we know that the IPCC defines it in terms of methane and nitrous oxide. But now, of course, there's so much conversation around soil carbon sequestration, and we have above ground biomass in the AFOLU sector. And so, how to work with both of those when we're talking about a target. And the target I'm about to show you is just focused on the emissions on methane and nitrous oxide because the scenarios don't incorporate carbon sequestration well, and there's some issues. But overall, we have to decide, are we talking about landscapes that include deforestation? Are we talking about supply chains? Are we talking about food loss and waste? Are we talking about consumption? There are many aspects of agriculture that one could use to define the target. And in this case, we're just looking at the IPCC more inventory-oriented sector definition. So just the non-CO2 gases. So a really important concept, and I wish I could see everybody's faces, but I'm on PowerPoint, so I can't. But just to see how many folks know about representative concentration pathways. These are just scenarios about the amount of warming that is expected each year based on emissions, right? So it's linking the amount of emissions to a warming level. And the different colors represent different trajectories that result in different temperature outcomes. And so it's really helpful for us to be able to compare. This doesn't even have the worst case, which is 8.5, I believe, but to compare, for example, those gray lines, which suggest an increase of over 5 degrees centigrade, to the purple line and the blue line at the bottom, which indicate the trajectory that we would need to have for a 2 degree or 3 degree centigrade limit by 2100. So the reason why these are so useful is these are scenarios that allow us to do a science-based target. And they tell us what our upper cap on emissions should be. And so that purple line, for example, if we want a 1.5 degree future, is what pretty much we have to track. It doesn't have to be precisely the same number in 2040 or 2060, but more or less it has to have the similar total cumulative emissions. So these are very, the representative concentration pathways are very simplistic in terms of their assumptions. And I'm just throwing this table up here as a reference. You can find this in the special IPCC report on 1.5 degrees. Basically what this table does is it gives you some of the assumptions behind the pathways for 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. And what you can see, I'll just summarize because you probably can't see the numbers that well or don't want to take the time, is that, for example, the categories of change are very simple. You know, pasture land is decreasing. Basically, they're making assumptions about livestock decreasing, which is a big red flag for Latin America, I know. They're making assumptions about cropland, making assumptions about cropland for energy, and then the total. And then they're making very important assumptions about forest land staying stable, especially after 2030. Okay, so that's just to say that these representative concentration pathways, or RCPs as they're known, are very simple assumptions, very simple models, very simple scenarios, and you know, take them with a grain of salt. But that's what we're currently basing science-based targets on. So how do we go about calculating a global target? And then I'll say something quickly about country-level targets. In addition to RCPs, representative concentration pathways, those scenarios about the future, the other key concept to remember is that we're looking at baselines into the future versus emissions under that RCP scenario, right? So what we're going to do to calculate our difference, our target of how much mitigation is necessary, is we're going to compare what's in that left-hand column with what in the right-hand column, and that's what our target is, right? So in any one year, like in 2040, under baseline emissions, there's a very high level. We would come over to 2040, and that difference to what the emissions necessary is our mitigation. And we can do that for, again, in the case of agriculture, methane and nitrous oxide. So the other key tool to know about is a wonderful database that IASA, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, that may be correct, I'm not sure, you have to look it up, but IASA, and you can see it here in the web address. They have a wonderful database of a number of integrated assessment model scenario data. And what I've done here is just given you the filters that you need to highlight the different models, because there are a number of different integrated assessment models that have calculated these scenarios. What is an integrated assessment model? It is just a combination of biophysical and social data, mostly economic and demographic data. They combine the two, and then they're able to ask questions about the future and generate, for a given population, for example, in 2020 or 2030 or 2040, what do we expect the greenhouse gases to be, okay? And you can see here on the left that we have different models, and it's useful. I want to stress it's really useful to not work with just one model, but to work across different models. So we have the AIM model, the GCAM model, the image model, the message model, the Remind Magpie model. And then what we're going to do is, well, and then let me just tell you, so then we have the scenarios for one, in this case, 1.5 degrees, which is referred to as 1.9 here, which is the 1.9 RCP. And then this is global. And then we look at the AFOLU sector. So again, just the non-CO2 gases, because those are the agricultural ones. And then we can look through each decade, what is expected under the scenario versus what is expected in the baseline. And again, our goal is to understand for the target what that difference is. So here you can see the graphic representation when we did this globally. You can see that the baseline into the future of the amount of emissions that we expect going out to 2100 is here, but the amount that we need for the 2-degree scenario in this case is the green line. And then in 2030, what that means is that we need about 1 gigaton of reduction per year. Okay, it actually changes as you can see, the green line goes down, so that number pretty much doubles by the time you get to 2050. So again, that's something to recognize, that the pathways are not necessarily constant. So what does that translate to if we look at it in terms of percentages? Like, just to use that same exact data, the same data, this data, and to calculate it in a slightly different way by looking at the base year as 2020, and to say what reductions are necessary going forward into the future. And here we have, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we have the different models represented in different colors. And you can just take the average value, or you could, consider the AIM model, the blue line, as an outlier. It's up to you. But you can then identify, what I've done is about a 20 to 25% reduction that's necessary in 2030, slightly higher in 2040, and slightly higher again in 2050. Okay, so that's a really simple number, and policymakers love working with, in my experience, something like a 20%, 25% number. It's much easier than working with the gigatons. So then very quickly, and I'm happy to answer questions about this, I just want to say, what does this mean for country level targets? So basically we have to take that global target, because climate change is at the global scale, that's where it matters, and then we have to allocate it to the different countries, right? And the IPCC has the rule about common but differentiated responsibilities and seeking equity. But when you dig a little bit deeper, you find that there are lots of principles related to equity, and there's been some very good work on this in climate change and greenhouse gas allocation science. So I'm just going to quickly go through what some of these principles are about how to share the effort. One is that you should be responsible for the cumulative emissions from either all sectors or from agriculture, basically since we've got data. Or since we know the emissions existed. So one approach is to look at distribute that 1 gigaton according or in proportion to the cumulative emissions of a country since they started emitting. Okay, either in agriculture or all sectors. The second is to look at the capability of the country. Maybe we should allocate that emissions based on either like whether you're a wealthy country or a not wealthy country, according to your gross domestic product, or maybe according to your HDI, your Human Development Index. Another possibility is this is a really interesting one, is to look at emissions per capita and try to create equality by a certain future year, 2030, 2050. That takes some work to get your head around, but we can talk about that if you'd like. And then finally, some combinations of these things. So really it's about whether you're looking at the responsibility because of past emissions, the capability of a country, or trying to create some per capita equal number. And this final slide just shows you, really interestingly, if you take an equal cumulative agricultural emissions per capita goal in 2050, basically say the world should allow every country to have equal emissions, you can see that countries that still have the capability to develop their emissions further are a lot of the poorer countries and have lower emissions per capita. And unfortunately, Latin America already has quite high emissions, and so they would have to decrease their emissions quite a bit in order to have that equal cumulative agricultural emissions per capita. Both the global and the country target material can be found in these articles, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linny. And Desi and Alejandro, Jacobo, and Felipe, those were wonderful. I think we have 5 or so minutes. Oh, Kelly, I see you have one. Actually, if anyone has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself and just shout it out to our participants. We have, I think, about 5 minutes or so for some questions.
Thanks. First, I had put a question in the chat that Jacobo and Felipe answered, so thank you. But one of my questions was about how we display that data. So when you show it by it's not district, I forget what it is, by geographical region, that doesn't exactly take into account kind of the economic dependence on livestock production. So I was just wondering, what data you've been choosing to show policymakers to help make the case about where they need to make the emissions reductions. And for Linny, thank you so much for that presentation. It was super clear. And I just had a question on the last slide, which is really fascinating. And I didn't know if that slide was, well, specific for ag or specific or kind of across all sectors, because it makes me wonder if how you take into account the contribution of those countries to the global food supply, right, and their supposed emission allotment, because some countries obviously are net importers and the net exporters, and it would seem to me that that would be a really crucial option, you know, for the agricultural sector in specific, or looking at kind of the number of livelihoods or jobs or created, you know, by the agricultural sector and the importance for those countries, just in terms of a more equitable approach. Thank you.
Jacobo, do you want to go first? Or I'm sorry, that was the first question for Daisy?
No, it's for Jacobo and
Yes.
Felipe. Again, just about how you choose to display the data for policymakers.
Yes, thank you, Kelly, for the question. I think since we were showing the case now of the national greenhouse gas inventories, so that was definitely only showing the emissions divided by regions. And this is the point that I tried to put in the chat, that is not the same. So not all animals emit the same. So of course, bigger animals, that, for example, for dairy production, emit more than small cattle or weaning cattle, and that's important. Regarding your specific question, of course, this is only seeing one part of the story, that is the total GHG emissions by department or by state, let's say, to put it in the US language. But of course, this needs to be correlated. How is this business? How is the production system there? What is the implication to the local economy, all of that, to make real interventions. But the first step, and the one that we were trying to show you today, is how important it is to have reliable and accurate data on the GHG emissions by region.
And
Okay, and for the greenhouse gases inventory in Colombia, Kelly, we use a bottom-up proxy. In this way, we have information about the 1,100 of municipality activity data from the livestock. So if you join the all municipality information of activity data, you can build the department or provincial information, and it's a bottom up for livestock emission.
So on the question of how to create equity in terms of global food security or livelihoods or trade, there are many ways you could, you know, create different criteria. So on trade, you could identify the country's emissions based on consumption, which is not how the IPCC currently accounts, but for emissions. But that is certainly something a lot of people have commented on, that countries that are net exporters are basically penalized. You could also, instead of looking at GDP, you know, in terms of capability, you could look at an index based on food security or lack of food security. So, you know, one can play around with those basic concepts of responsibility and capability, as well as, you know, the accounting for emissions, and all of those analyses are warranted.
I think Katie just dropped a question in the chat about the Ruminant model, just asking if it's a publicly available tool or if it was something you accessed specifically for the purposes of your work.
Yes, Ruminant is a publicly available model.
Great. Okay, I think, does anyone have any final thoughts or questions? I think if anything else arises later on, perhaps, you know, we could reach back out to you guys for some additional thoughts if any other questions arise. But does anyone have any final thoughts before we reconvene to our main group? Otherwise, thank you all so much. These presentations were wonderful. I think it was a great connection to the process we discussed and really seeing how these play out in practice and how you can use them to make decisions. So, we really appreciate your time, and hopefully we'll be able to connect further on some of these things. And I think with that, we can jump back into the main group and we'll be in touch. All right, thank you all so much.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.